The text that Dottie Hayes read for us this morning is the conclusion to Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, a sermon which occupies 3 whole chapters in Matthew's Gospel. My sermons over these past 4 Sundays in Lent have discussed Jesus' sermon. Things such as the Beatitudes, which indicate the kind of identity that Jesus looks for in his followers. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are the meek and the merciful and the peacemakers and the persecuted. I mean, I know you know all that stuff. You've heard it all before. I'm not going to take the time this morning to review the issues that Jesus addressed in his sermon, such things as his low opinion of calling people fool, of adultery, of divorce, his call for us to be boldly different, like salt in the world and like light, because he knows people will see who we are by what we do, to never hold grudges, never indulge in anger, be the first to reach out a hand of reconciliation, that practice of straightforward speech where yes means yes and no means no, his desire that we reject revenge and not take retaliation against our enemies, but instead we should love our enemies, and we should pray for those who persecute us, and we should turn the other cheek, and we should go that second mile. And oh yes, we should stop judging our neighbors. But I know you know all that. You've heard that Sermon on the Mount many a time in church. And I won't even go into Jesus' famous golden rule about doing to others what you would like them to do to you if the roles were reversed, if the shoe was on the other foot, so to speak. No, I'm going to skip all of that stuff and start my sermon this morning at the very last thing that Jesus said in his Sermon on the Mount. I want you to hear again his stirring conclusion, his ultimate punchline. These are the last words that hung in the air there on that hillside in Galilee. The rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell, and great was the fall of it. It fell? The house collapsed? Is that any way to end a sermon? I mean, I know, what a downer. What a bummer. He would not have got a passing grade in any of my seminary preaching classes. Sorry, Jesus. With an ending like that? Jesus concluded his sermon not on the high point of faith, but with a tragic picture of a hurricane. It's an image of rain falling on the Galilean mountainside, rushing down the swollen rivers of mud to meet the rising floodwaters. This is not at all a happy picture. It is what we saw just this month, flooding the Great Plains. And throughout the Midwest, we've seen those pictures and we hear the horror of those floods. And also right now it's happening in parts of Southeast Africa. More than 500 people were washed away in the recent cyclone. Malawi, Mozambique. The rain fell. The floods came. And the winds blew and beat against the house, and it fell, and great was its fall. Now, years ago, I went to Honduras with 10 members of the United Church of Christ and the Disciples of Christ. Together with our Honduran work partners, we built a half a dozen houses, small houses, I mind you, in a banana plantation for families who had lost everything in Hurricane Mitch. We didn't build on the ground, nor on a slab. Unlike the workers in Jesus' parables, we built neither upon the sand nor upon the rock. We built our houses on stilts. Stilts. Each floor was set upon 9 concrete pilings that were embedded in the earth. We hoped that the houses on stilts would be above the water line when the rivers flooded again. It is our hope that each one-room, second-floor house was so well balanced on those 9 concrete and rebar columns that it will not blow over in a storm. It will not collapse into a raging flood. That's our hope. The fact is, we won't know. We won't really know how our efforts will stand up to the brunt of another hurricane until the next one hits Honduras. You see, life itself has a way of revealing the strengths and the weaknesses of what we attempt to do. When the storms hit, that's when we discover together whether or not our preparations, our diligent efforts were enough. Before those amateur efforts at house building, I had never really noticed the inherent anxiety produced by Jesus' concluding words in this sermon. When he says the rain fell and the floods came and the winds blew and beat against the house and it fell. Oh no, great was the fall of it. If you've been through that, those are terrible words, fearful words. Now, when Jesus had finished saying these things, the crowds were astonished at his teaching, writes Matthew. Maybe they expected something a little more inspiring from Jesus as his concluding statement to the sermon. Maybe they expected a punchline more in keeping with what the scribes and the teachers of Torah would have done. You know, things like, hey, everything's going to be all right. Don't worry. Be happy. God is in control. You're blessed. You're chosen. Good folks don't have to worry about bad things happening. If you just follow those rules, God is going to keep you safe. See, but Jesus doesn't follow the sermonic norm. He tells it like it is. Chaos and all. Real sermons come. Real storms come. Real floods happen. Even to those people who are standing there listening to him. Tragedy strikes in the real world. Jesus reminds us even those things that we build with utmost good faith, with good intentions, and to the best of our ability, they may falter, they may fail, they may fall in the end. And with those words said, Jesus turned and headed back down the mountain. And I say, hey, that's no way to end a sermon, Jesus. Where's the blessed assurance? How can Jesus leave it like that? Leave it up to us, the listeners, to decide how are we supposed to interpret his words? How are we supposed to apply what he's talking about? But that's the way Jesus is. He leaves it to his listeners to act or not to act on what he has told them. The crowd that day had listened. I'm sure they listened. They heard what Jesus was saying. In fact, I think they listened so well that here we are 2,000 years later, and we have a relatively good sense of what Jesus taught. I believe the people did hear him say all those radical things that Matthew reports to us. But I wonder how many people in that crowd actually believed what Jesus was saying. I mean, they heard him. But did they hear him? If you are like me, we often fool ourselves into thinking that if we hear something, well, then we know it, right? We don't need to be told again, right? We got it. But let me put it this way. If we hear something and we believe it, we say, well, we know it. And knowing something to be true means we assume that's going to affect our actions in some way. But the fact is, we quite often fail to do anything about what we say we believe. We may know something to be true, but that knowledge itself does not necessarily motivate us to any action. We hear something. We may even say it to others, what I heard, because we know it to be true, because we believe it, hearing it, knowing it, saying it. It's not enough. You know that UCC slogan on the magnet that I passed out to you a couple of weeks ago? It reminds us to believe is to care, and to care is to do. Saying we believe something, saying we believe is good, but it's not enough. Even caring deeply about something is good, but it's not enough. We have to move our faith from our mouth to our muscles, from knowing with our brains to actually doing with our behavior. And believing itself doesn't always come easily. I've sometimes found myself refusing to believe what my eyes and my ears are telling me. As Spock used to say on Star Trek, this does not compute. If what we have come across doesn't fit the expected pattern, we just tend to miss it. Or we dismiss it. I can't believe it. That just can't be true. Nobody's ever told me that before. We hear it, but it strikes us as odd. It's unusual. It's a novelty. This is a new thing. Utterly unexpected, maybe unbelievable, so we don't take it in very well. As we've seen over the past 4 weeks of Jesus' sermon, much of what he taught in that Sermon on the Mount went against the grain. Went against the grain of the Bible scribes' traditional interpretation of the law. Jesus' ideas ran counter to the cultural norms and standards of his day. It just didn't make common sense. And let's face it, most of the things Jesus said in that sermon about the identity of his followers, or about the new path that is ahead of them, about the ethical demands of loving one's neighbor wholeheartedly and all the rest, it still goes against our common sense. We hear you, Jesus, but we're just not buying it. Love your enemies? Come on, get real, for God's sake. In fact, really the bulk of his Sermon on the Mount was, you heard it said this and this is what you've been taught, and this is the way we think, but I tell you this, something entirely different. The guys in church of our society, in church and society, they all think this way, but I'm telling you this. Jesus did not agree with the conventional thinking or the dominant religious ethics of his day. Instead, he taught something new. Jesus was a novelty. He was an oddity. And I suppose the Jerusalem-oriented people in the crowd could simply dismiss Rabbi Jesus. Here he goes, another radical activist from Galilee.